JC, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how's it going, Elijah? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. So, without saying, you're welcome to say as little or as much as you want to do, or you can say no. But, everyone said that you're the anon account that all the other anons blocked. And so if you're willing to, can you share a bit of, why you started this account, because not everyone just comes up to X and is like, you know what, I'm going to start an anon account, saying that, Hitler wasn't a Christian and all of this other stuff and fighting against it. So, how did you get started with the account and exactly why? And then if you're willing to tell the story of why you're anon.
Yeah, so I think I started the account. I can actually double check real quick because I have it pulled up. I started it in June of 2022. And before that point, I had been involved in right-wing politics more generally, but I had known and interacted with a whole lot of dissident right people, both online and in person, that were friends of mine all the way back to maybe 2015, 2016 time period. So like immediately pre-Trump, and then for the first term for Trump. And one thing that I noticed was there was just sort of an increasing embitteredness about American politics that was kind of expanding beyond the purview of just normal day-to-day news cycle and going into issues that were more theologically impactful. And one thing that I kept seeing was young guys who I felt like had a pretty strong and Christian or Christ-like reaction to some of the depravity we're seeing morally in the West today. But their reaction to that was going beyond Scripture's warrant, and they were beginning to make cases for things that I saw were rather evil, right? And so I started interacting with a lot of these guys, like I said, back in 2015, 2016, started to see the development of some of the earlier alt-right, which people barely use the term for anymore. But some of the old Richard Spencer time period guys, Identity of Europa, different groups like that, different people in those sort of sects. And I just sort of saw a disconnect between how many of those guys claim to be Christians, and would promote this sort of aesthetic and forward-facing appearance of being believers, while not necessarily applying that to their beliefs and views, especially related to 20th century history. And it seemed like the focal point of that was Hitler. And there were a lot of people that were making the claim that in order to progress the Christian conservative, what now would be called kind of Christian nationalist movement, but back then didn't really have a name, that we needed to kind of rehabilitate Hitler, or at least try to, in the public discourse, reduce the negative reaction that people had to him. And that was pretty, it wasn't exactly shocking to me at the time when I first kind of encountered these things, because I could see how it logically flowed to that point. But it was just really saddening to me because I found that a lot of those guys were not applying biblical principles that they were claiming throughout their politics. And they were a lot more driven by disdain for the left and being, they were much more reactionary than they were driven by sort of like a righteous understanding of what the state ought to be. And so I made the account, and my original thing, I bought this book by Richard Weikart, which was the inspiration for my pinned thread. And I think the first 60 or 70 posts on my pinned thread on Twitter, which is now 90-something posts long, were excerpts from Richard Weikart's book about Hitler's religious belief, called Hitler's Religion. And so I went through that book really in a super detailed fashion. I sent some emails to him. I was able to find sources for some of the original documents that he had cited from stuff like Goebbels' diary and Rosenberg's diary, as well as some various things from Table Talks and Krista Schroeder and all these other people. And so I found the original quotations that he cited and compiled them all in a really long thread. And since I did that, that thread blew up initially, but ever since then, probably 4 or 5 times a day, if not more, someone will send that thread to someone else on X or Twitter, whatever we want to call it now. And as a way to sort of combat this view that Hitler was a Christian or a Christian prince, or even really like a righteous person at all, that we should be exemplifying in our politics as believers. And so that sort of morphed into my account in general, which is now focused more on just handling some of the ills I see on the dissident right, which is really funny because I've spent my whole life in the political right up to this point. If you look at the political landscape in the U.S. today, I would be considered very far right by any sort of reasonable estimation. The Nazis don't see it that way, but I'm not really particularly concerned with their impression of the political landscape, to be honest.
Yeah.
But like, so for instance, I'm in favor of completely freezing all migration for like 100 years or something in that time frame. I'd also be in favor of some laws that may resemble some kind of form of theonomy in terms of explicit recognition of Christianity within the government, as well as laws against things like adultery, and then some biblically based punishment criteria for things like that. And so I've kind of found myself in a gap where I was aligning with a lot of people that were saying things about how the state should be explicitly Christian, but there was a subsect of those people that I had already interacted with, and I could understand their mindset from all the way back in like 2015, 2016, that were starting to creep in and begin to go full Hitler, as we would call it, right, in the lingo. And so I'm trying to push back on some of that, because one of the reasons I think the left has lost cultural power is they did not curtail their crazies. I don't think they curtailed the real insane woke people on their side. And whether or not we like the term woke right or not on our side, we do have some crazies, and I don't think it's beneficial to a Christian conservative movement, or even a Christian nationalist movement, to tolerate people that are comfortable sort of playing outside of that, and saying things and advocating for things that are unrighteous. So I just felt convicted about that. It caused me to create the account, and since then it's spiraled into a lot of different areas. And I get a lot of messages from pastors from all sorts of different denominations on Twitter or X rather, asking me about how to handle this one young guy in their church that said at a Bible study that Hitler was actually a great man who fought for Western civilization and or I guess fought for his people, they would say, right? And so I sort of feel like I foresaw some of the wave of the impetus in the cultural right that we're seeing today. And I was already prepared to counter some of it because of my previous experiences, whereas a lot of people in the church weren't. And so I felt like in that way, God has given me a place in that. So sorry if that's a long answer.
No, that's perfect. So if you're comfortable sharing it, you've mentioned before that you were doxxed by Antifa and then doxxed by some people on the right. Is that why you're anon? And if you're willing to share some of that story?
Yeah. So I guess it actually, funnily enough, I think it was back in mid-2022, right before I actually created this account. I was doxxed by Antifa in my local area. I live in Texas. And that was because I attended a drag show for children that was at a gay bar, and I was protesting it. I say attended, I was protesting it. Yeah. And I was outside the event. I got on camera several different times. I made some video recordings of that event that ended up in some national networks. And because of that, I caught the attention, I guess, again, because it had happened a little bit before, but of local Antifa people. And so they blasted all my information out there, and really didn't like the fact that I was going into these environments and heckling the people involved in these events that I consider to be, if not pedophilias themselves, pedophilia adjacent, trying to sexualize, the lives of our young children. And after that, just because I was also interested at the same time, was handling some of the stuff I saw that was really going wrong on the right, I made this account, and I believe it was just a few months ago, 3 or 4 months ago now, the the dissident right people that I contend with online discovered that docs from Antifa and sort of tried to add to it. And they didn't do a good job of adding to it because they got a lot of bad information. But they got all that info and then they reposted it. And the funny thing about that was that a lot of the reactions on the dissident right were, why are you working together with Antifa to dox this guy?
Yeah.
And so ironically, although it was, stressful a little bit to have to, have people DM you pictures of your face or your wife or whatever, it, I think, ultimately validated me a little bit in the eyes of some people on the dissident right, because it revealed that I wasn't some sort of leftist actor that was trying to, destroy the right. Right. I really do have good intentions for the right wing. And I think the only way we're going to progress really a biblical worldview forward in the public sphere is if we hold our people accountable to biblical standards, and in the same way that we should do in the church. We don't get to exempt politics from biblical commands on how to treat each other, and biblical axioms that exist all through the Bible about things like honesty, and even partiality. And I'm seeing a lot of people that are very tempted because of the depravity and the moral degeneracy in our day to day, be comfortable becoming lax on those sort of biblical standards, so long as they see it as a way to beat the left. And I'm not comfortable letting the left control the frame in that way.
Yeah. So you've mentioned, a couple things about, and it was Seth Dillon who, if I can paraphrase it a bit, but he said that, the woke right is almost as worse or as bad as the woke left. It's just a different variation, a different variant of the same virus. But then you have these other people who are, on the right politically, like yourself and other Christians. But then you have these other people who are on the right who are saying, oh, Hitler was a Christian. And maybe there's some people on the right who are saying, I don't want to be associated with them. Yet, yes, we say they're on the woke right, but it's still the right. So, what would you say to these people, and maybe give them a piece of advice as they're struggling with this, where they're like, I'm on, the right side of politics instead of the left side, but I don't want to be associated with these people.
Yeah, so I think the real way to handle that is just to be really cautious about sort of what you label yourself as online and in person to other people when you talk politics, because probably a year ago or more, I would have been rather comfortable saying that I was a Christian nationalist based on the criteria of Christian nationalism as I understood it. Mm-hmm. But seeing that movement develop and how comfortable so many who have that label are identifying themselves with a belief that Nazi Germany was sort of like a Christian idyllic form of a state, I'm way less comfortable just saying, oh, I'm a Christian nationalist. So I would usually not be comfortable just saying that outright. What I would do is just clarify specifically what I believe about those things, on a bunch of different topics like immigration, economics, things like this, social issues, rather than just say, well, I'm a Christian nationalist, and then assuming it's all kind of going to work itself out.
Everyone gets what you're saying.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So there's also a tendency right now that was it Netter, which is no enemies to the right, or don't punch right, and I can sort of understand the reaction of, we don't want to unfairly string up people on who are our political allies, at least for the moment, over things that can be handled internally. I can understand that, but what it has seemingly turned into is we are never, as people on the right, allowed to morally I don't even want to say call out, but make judgments even about people to the right of us politically. And I think that that is contrary to a biblical instinct of impartiality, but also just a biblical instinct of a love for the righteousness of God. That I don't get to somehow assess the politics of a person before assessing their actions, and then depending upon what they think about immigration or something like that, not make a judgment if they're saying something that seems profoundly unrighteous. And I think a lot of people are tempted by that today because the focus is so much on the left and how the left is pushing so much depravity that we have to have allies that we would not otherwise have. And I'm not convinced that Christians are ever in a situation where we're morally obligated to ignore unrighteousness or be cozy with it for the purpose of practical goals. And I don't see biblical evidence for that either.
Yeah. So obviously I want to get into a couple of things, like, Corey Mallard and Stonewire are big, promoters of, Hitler was a Christian and everything. But then, so when do you think that, the post-World War II consensus and Holocaust denialism began? Because it seems to have surged since COVID, because now everyone's like, we can't, because of all the lies about COVID, we cannot trust the government anymore. But obviously it started before then. So when do you think was, the beginning of people starting to believe that in the post-World War II consensus and denying the Holocaust?
So I think, there have been people that have been doing this since World War II. The unique thing now is how it has moved into popular culture on the right so dramatically, because you do have people like Candace Owens that, whether or not they would explicitly come out and say that I don't believe that millions died in the Holocaust, and if they did, it wasn't bad, right? Although Candace wouldn't come out and say that. If you know and understand people in this sphere on the real dissident side who have an affinity for National Socialism, you'll begin to pick up on things that she and other people will say, and you say, oh, well, that's what she's clearly being fed by, right? She's getting influence, at least from that direction. One of those things would be like Dresden, or discussion of, mass deaths of typhus during World War II, things like this, things that did happen. But it's pretty obvious if you are aware of what's going on in that space, what those types of people are thinking and what they're projecting about that. I've seen people bring up Dresden when talking about the Holocaust, online, and say, well, didn't we bomb Dresden? It's like, yeah. And I'm comfortable saying that something like Dresden was immoral. And I'm also comfortable saying that, putting people in camps or mass shooting them in fields, or dumping them in pits at Babi Yar and places like this, I'm comfortable saying that's also very sinful. But it's turned into sort of a reactionary way to avoid those implications, to talk about how the ills of what the Allies did during World War II and things like that.
Yeah.
I think as these things become more understood on the right, and we have more and more public figures that are very impactful on the right begin to talk about these topics, there will be more people like me that pop up and will point out, like, hey, no, I actually do think that these things happened, like the Holocaust, and I think that they're deeply immoral. And I don't feel the need in some way to rehabilitate Hitler in order to combat the left. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. There's going to be more and more of a divide in that way. And I can just hope that that Christians are discerning when looking at that landscape in that regard, to be able to assess it according to the facts of the situation and Scripture, and not just their repulsion to the post-war consensus, right? I don't like using the term, I kind of alluded to it maybe earlier, but I don't really like using the term woke right. I've talked to Neil Shinvey, who is one of the proponents of this term, about this, and I think that although the reactionary mindset of the left is reflected in the dissident right, they have a pretty fundamentally different mindset and worldview. And so I don't think it's just, it's the woke on the left, but just on the right. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's a lot of distinctive differences around group behavior, group values, and in goals in terms of things like egalitarianism and democracy and stuff like this. And so I urge people to maybe who are comfortable saying woke right, to maybe look at the dissident right a little bit deeper than just, well, it's just wokies, but they're for white people, because I don't think it's that simple.
Mm-hmm. So, as I was, prepping for this interview and everything, people, will say that Hitler and the Nazis were, promoters of, like, quote, positive Christianity. Like even a major news said that. And so, since they're promoters of positive Christianity, therefore they're against certain things like, Jewish traditions, for example, and things like that. And what we're saying is, no, Hitler, like, wasn't a Christian. There is, there's full evidence. And, I saw, a bit ago, the movie Valkyrie, and where, it's making the point that not every, German was a Nazi. But to say that Hitler and the Nazis were promoting positive Christianity, that just seems like way, way out of bounds. And so, like, how would you respond to people who are saying that? Because they're like, well, if he's promoter of positive Christianity, therefore, that's why, he committed mass genocide against the Jews, because, he's against that.
Yeah, so positive Christianity was sort of a rather ecumenical version, I would say a perversion of Christianity that was dreamed up by Hitler and his inner circle, as a way to unify all of, like, Catholics and Lutherans or Protestants specifically, underneath the National Socialist cause. And there's pretty good reason to believe that it was only ever seen as a utilitarian method of, or not utilitarian, but a sort of a pragmatic need in order to get the population to fall in line. But there were people that dissented from this. I posted not that long ago, I guess it was probably maybe a month or a little bit under, a letter between two Wehrmacht soldiers on the Eastern Front, and they discuss back and forth. And in this one letter, one of the guys says, what we're doing to the Jews here in the East, right? Which he says, like, God's chosen people, and I think he even puts chosen people in quotes, so you can kind of see what his mindset is around Jews in that too. He wasn't a dispensationalist, right? He says, like, what we're doing is beyond anti-Semitism, right? So how will we ever be forgiven for this, or something? He says like that. I think it's how will we ever atone for this, right? And so the general German population believed that positive Christianity was a restoration of Christianity within Germany, with minor overemphases on the state being almost a divine thing in their minds. But it wasn't heretical enough outright to scare all the Germans who were Christians away, because 90+% of Germany, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of like 93 to 96% during that whole period were Christians, or at least claimed to be Christians. And so Hitler's rhetoric was always very careful not to alienate what the general population held dear, which would be Christianity. But when we look at some of his other writings, other things that were recorded by his inner circle, I mentioned Goebbels and Rosenberg earlier being two primary ones, it's pretty clear how he viewed positive Christianity, and that the ultimate end goal after winning the war would be to phase that out in form of and turn it into some sort of Volkish, like I would say neo-pantheistic worship of the German people as an idea. And Hitler talks about ancestors being something that that should be held up as almost like gods. He kind of says some things that seem to deify that. He deifies nature in some speeches. And if you read, there's a book by a guy named Cadus Fabricus from the time too, who was trying to defend positive Christianity to Christians that were identifying some issues with it even early on. He has to try to explain, Hitler doesn't actually worship nature, even though he called nature omnipotent, right? Or because he says that, nature is Lord and things like this. He's actually just talking in generalities about something like God expressing himself through nature and things like this. So there was already people recognizing that, but the bulk of the German population in general were comfortable with positive Christianity as it was. But Hitler never, I don't think, ever genuinely believed it in any real sense. I mean, he tells Goebbels, I have it actually right here verbatim in 39, the best way to finish off the churches is to be a more positive Christian. And so the idea is that this was always set up as something that would be used to phase out the institutional power of Christianity. And so when people just look at it and say today, okay, well, look, Hitler promoted positive Christianity, it's a little bit like the way that Black Lives Matter named themselves, where, if you disagree with Black Lives Matter, then you think black people aren't made in the image of God or something. And it's really a sort of a silly rhetorical tool to be able to hold people account to and say, oh, look, Hitler believed in positive Christianity. Don't you like positivity? Don't you like Christianity? That's not really what it was. And even in more programmatic writings around like for the Hitler's Youth and in some SS documentation, it's pretty clear that the next generation, there was intent to raise that next generation with less of a affinity for Christianity and much more of an affinity for just the Volk as some sort of general spiritual entity that was worthy of veneration, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so from your research, what do you think is maybe the biggest reason that, people believe, Hitler was this Christian prince and everything, and that they deny the Holocaust?
So, for Hitler being a Christian prince, it would be just people that are inclined to take him at his word in public speeches, because he does say publicly, he claims to be a Catholic publicly. He claims that the Lord is guiding him in this great quest against international Jewry and things like this. And so people that are already primed through their disdain for Jews today will look back on that and see some of the depravity of Weimar mirrored in some of the difficulties we see now and say, well, hold on, why have we been taught that this guy is so evil when it seems that what he was saying was actually maybe something that was the solution to issues that we're having today. And I don't think a lot of people that fall into this have some sort of natural hatred of Jews based upon negative experiences they've personally had with Jews. A lot of these people have just seen internet memes that haven't been accurate a lot of the time surrounding things like Jewish power and where Jews are involved. And based upon that, have really built up in their minds a view of Jews as being sort of like a great evil that is forever going to plague the West until the West gets rid of them. And it's not really a new thing. I mean, like I mentioned a second ago, Weimar Germany was a similar mindset. And I think that as young men especially become increasingly deracinated and disenfranchised, they're going to be looking for a tangible enemy that they can point to and sort of consider to be the root of all of the evils and difficulties they have in their life. And so that's what I think is more going on, more so than people are, the simplistic view that often the left has, which is, they just hate Jews because they're different, or they just hate Jews because they just do, or something. I think that there are people thinking through this. They're not looking at it broadly enough. I know before we talked just now, Elijah, you mentioned that you read some of Doug Wilson's stuff, and Doug's written a book. I think it's American Milk and Honey, I think is what it is, which is really focused on the Jews, and he goes into a lot of detail around how there is a lot of misunderstandings of what even the Talmud even is, because a lot of people think that Jews obey the Talmud like Christians obey the 66 books of the Bible, which is just not, it's not accurate to what that is. And there's also a lot of confusion around overrepresentation of Jews, because every time you find Jews overrepresented in pornography or in socialist economics, you'll find them also highly overrepresented in classical economics, or overrepresented even in things like medical research. So it's more so that they're just a uniquely they're a unique people in the sense that they seem to ascend hierarchies in all these places very quickly, all over the place. And in places where that's very evil, it's very evil, and in places where that's very good, it's very good. But it's easy to just look at the sections of our culture where it has been pernicious and say, okay, well then obviously all the issues we're having today must be the fault of the Jews. And that was really a center point of Hitler's worldview too. If you read any amount of his speeches, it's very rare that he has any speech where he doesn't talk about how the Jews are a uniquely pernicious and evil force on Germany, that are ultimately causing its downfall. And the entire war was really framed by Hitler as a self-defense of the German people against the Jews. And what the reality of the Holocaust revealed was how that wasn't true, in the sense that the Jews did not have any substantial power within the German population pretty quickly after Hitler started to change things, and that he went far beyond merely a concern of the overrepresentation of Jews in different parts of the culture to the point of wanting to exterminate them, and largely exterminating them. And so that denial is based in a recognition on the dissident right that they cannot acknowledge that happened, because it sort of undermines Hitler's original claims that he made publicly, that he was only trying to help the German people, and that he was comfortable with just Jews not having certain power. Like he genuinely did hate them, considered them vermins and rats, and wanted them to be annihilated. And that's something that's very difficult to square with Christian morality, obviously. And so the only other option, if you are already committed to liking Hitler, would be, well, it didn't happen. And that's where you end up in that zone. So
yeah, so I mean, everyone's like, well, these the Jews are behind all these industries and did all these bad things and have done all these bad things. And it's like, yes, and we're not saying that, what I'm about to say is not saying that, that's fine. But if you also look at people like, Rahab was a prostitute, and then she, was embedded into, the Israel, and then, David, sinned with Bathsheba, and then in order to reconcile that, he killed, her wife, her husband. And so it's just different things like that where we're not saying, like we can't judge people on, just if they do like a terrible thing, like, or just one bad thing, because, the Bible says, judge and you shall be judged. But then if people put that argument forth where it's like that, where we're not saying what the Jews have done is fine, but there's also examples of people who have done bad things and then are still Christians that brought in, like Peter denied Jesus 3 times. But then people might reverse that and say, well, so if you're saying we can't judge someone on just a bad thing they did, then therefore you can't judge Hitler, for the Holocaust. Like, if someone put that argument out for you, like, how would you say that? How would you explain it?
Yeah, so, I mean, I wouldn't accept the framing that Christians shouldn't judge others for immoral behavior in general. I think it has to come from a place of humility. And I've always been pretty clear and adamant that I believe that if Hitler genuinely repented, that he would have been saved, regardless of the movement that he created, ending up so incredibly evil on the basis of, his machinations. And so I think that really the distinction needs to be around we always have to recognize that grace could redeem anyone. And
Mhm.
I don't, some people don't believe me on this, but I don't have some sort of like, I don't go to sleep at night and like think how much I hate Hitler as I like lay there in bed or something. Like
Sure.
I really don't. The
Mhm.
only reason that I am really concerned with this topic is because I believe it has been misrepresented to people, and there are a lot of people that are either knowingly or unknowingly defending a very evil figure who did some very evil things on the basis of their political expediency today. And as Christians, that makes me sad in the same way that it makes me sad when I see people on the left undermine biblical principles in terms of what they will tolerate when it comes to their politics.
Mhm.
And so I'm just seeing that same sort of pattern on the right, and I don't think that we're necessarily being hypocritical by continuing to recognize the immoral things that did happen in Nazi Germany. And I think, and I kind of alluded to this when I mentioned the Workblock earlier, but there were lots of genuinely Christian people in Germany who were in all different sections of the Nazi Party. That's just not deniable. And now you can say that what they were doing, working for the regime at all, was evil, but there was a lot of people didn't know the extent of what was going on. A lot of people were accepting the false claims being made about who were being persecuted and why they were being persecuted. So Christians can be deceived. And I don't think that a general hatred for the German people at that time is at all warranted. And so I do think that a lot of the shame that Germans feel today and things like that, I think that's not biblical either. I think that the world's put that on Germany to a degree, and that's wrong. And over time, that I think that will heal, and people will feel less of that. There's conversations like that going on in Germany right now, and that have been in the news even in the last couple months. But I don't think that Christians are somehow, through Christ's words, held to a standard where we can't make moral judgments about things, especially things as heinous as rounding up women and children and shooting them and dumping them in the trench somewhere, right? I mean, that's like, I can't imagine, like hands that shed innocent blood are things that are a thing that God hates, right? And I think that it's completely fair for us to recognize that as deeply evil and be repulsed by it. And so one of the things I have an issue with, at least with the rhetoric about the post-war consensus, is that I think a lot of the reason for what would be referred to today as the post-war consensus was built on the basis of a recognition that those things in Germany were evil because the West largely had Christian principles guiding it. And so to say we should just reject the post-war consensus, it's like, well, no, hold on. Some of the reasoning behind why we came to the conclusion so that we did of how we can avoid this in the future were on the basis of people who were believers looking at that and saying, wow, that was so evil. Let's not do that again. And so I would say what we more so need to do is just assess critically the presuppositions of our modern day and modern age without feeling the need to somehow defend what went on in that period either.
Yeah. And even like, it just boggles my mind, when I, started discovering this, and discovering that this was, a very big issue, which was when, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very good friends with Will Spencer, host of the Will Spencer podcast. And I didn't really know this was a big thing until, people like Eric Kahn and Joel Webben started attacking him, and then attacking Pastor Yuri Brito, who, I follow his work, and I'm actually interviewing him.
Awesome.
And then like attacking Doug Wilson, and I was like, wait, what's going on here? Because, maybe a year or so ago, like it was highly recommended that I listen to, Eric Kahn's, I forget, it's like Hardman podcast or whatever.
I can't think of it either off the top of my head, but I know what you're talking about.
but now it's like, now don't listen to that, and everything. Uh, and so when I started seeing that it's a huge deal and like everyone's freaking out about it, it just boggles my mind that people can say the Holocaust didn't happen because there's so much like evidence of it. And I get some people say, well, something else happened, but like, it might have been Man's Search for Meaning, by Viktor Frankl. But my dad was reading a short bit a while ago, and it was like, maybe it wasn't Man's Search for Meaning. It could have been. I don't remember off the top of my head. But it was like, we were going into the, walking into the gas chambers, in Auschwitz and the concentration camps, and people are going in, with the Lord's Prayer on their lips and the Shema Israel. And it's like, they knew like what was going to happen to them. And like you read books like The Hiding Place and everything, and you see all this evidence.
Right.
And it's like, how are you denying that this happened? Like, there are literally people living today that will tell you, my parents or my grandparents or my great-grandparents were stuck in a concentration camp by the Nazis, beaten, and barely made it out of there alive. It's like, how do you think that this never happened?
Yeah, I think there's different levels of it. So what I've run into more recently, actually, as this has become more mainstream on the right, is less people saying that it never happened at all, and more so people trying to obfuscate the moral depravity of the thing by saying that they were placed in camps with good conditions, and then they just so happened to die en masse of typhus or starvation, and they consider that to sort of redeem the National Socialist regime from that sin. That somehow means that our view of it is not accurate. And throughout history, there have been all kinds of different revisionists that take different positions on this. It's pretty easy to cut through the level of that sort of denial just by pointing out, if you put a bunch of people in a camp where they mass die from disease and starvation, you're still responsible for that. So that's one thing. But even still, the evidence for the intentional killings is overwhelming. There's good evidence that they had a massive cremation capacity at places like the Auschwitz complex. The cremas were used to gas Jews and then cremate them. There's photographs. There's a really infamous photograph, which I believe I put on my Substack because I reposted Eric Hunt's, who used to be a denier and I guess he recanted and now he's kind of a schizophrenic. But anyway, he made a really long blog post about why he no longer denied the Holocaust. And one of the reasons in his mind was that there were certain images of people being taken into the gas chamber that have never been explained by deniers. Things like this. And there are mass graves. There are records from people even like Patton that death camps did exist. The denial really is based around trying to avoid whatever moral responsibility falls on the National Socialist regime. And or just a general dismissal of it as being relevant, right? That yeah, maybe this all happened, but that shouldn't dictate our political policy today. And on some level, I think that's kind of true. Yeah. I don't think that we need to be afraid of empowering a truly righteous person from making changes in the federal government because he could go full Hitler and put everybody in camps or something. I think that that we're not anywhere near that where that needs to be a concern. But depending on who you're interacting with, they may or may not have drank, more or less of the Kool-Aid. So you have to be careful while interacting with them and try to figure out what they actually believe about it. And what I find a lot of times when I have these conversations is quite a few people have imbibed or absorbed through osmosis, through all these memes, a belief about that period, which is false in general. And if you just ask them, like, hey, what do you think they did to the people in camps? Do you think they even put them in camps, right? Like, do you think that they just deported them? If they deported them, where did they go? when you start asking those sort of questions, you find pretty quickly that a lot of people's knowledge of that is really shallow, and their basis for the beliefs that they would espouse online mostly just come from memes that are generally not very accurate or misrepresenting that. That's at least what I've found.
Yeah. So you said you've seen, people that will say, it wasn't that big of a deal, or try and, bring it down a couple notches, and maybe not straight out deny that, okay, maybe it did happen, but it's not as bad as we've been told it was. But then there's also those people who say, okay, Holocaust didn't happen, but this happened and that explains why we have all this evidence. So what are some of the examples you've been told where it's like Holocaust didn't happen, but this happened? What are some of those things that you've heard?
Yeah, so I will hear something to the effect often of, well, all the people that they put in these camps were partisans, so these were like explicitly communist operatives that just happened to be Jewish, and they were putting them in these camps. The problem with that was that there's a lot of documentation that quite a few of them are women and children. We even have record from Goebbels' diary where he talks about how the Nazi policy when sending people east was to separate them 60-40 into those who could work to be slave labor, and then the rest were to be liquidated, as he would say, through what he calls a barbaric process, which doesn't sound like deportation to me. And so those sort of points that I see are usually pretty easily refuted just by having a cursory understanding of some of the original documents surrounding the period. I rarely have a conversation with somebody who believes something like that where they just change their mind in the moment. But I very often have a conversation with somebody like that where other people are watching. And then I will be contacted by those other people who say something like, wow, I was really confused because I kept seeing all these memes about about the Holocaust, saying that it didn't happen, or that it wasn't as it's been represented. And then you just, you showed this guy this documentation and he had no answer to it. And so now, I don't know what to think. Right. And so really in a lot of these conversations, it's more about trying to find the people that are genuinely looking for the truth, not changing the minds of ideologues that are already so committed to their position that there's nothing you're going to be able to say to change their mind. And there are a growing amount of people that are in that sort of ideologue class, but because the right, I think, is growing in general, there's also more people who are in that other category who are trying to figure out what's going on. And because most of the information on this also is from a politically left-leaning bias, they're not equipped with a lot of good detailed info to be able to ascertain what's going on either. And one of the areas where I think that was lacking was surrounding some of the theology in Nazi Germany, and I was trying to, by creating the account, fill the gap that I saw there with good information, so that people could be equipped to handle and assess these things with good discernment. So.
Yeah, and so you can push back against this if you want to, but a lot of people that seem to say, Hitler was this Christian prince and will in a way deny the Holocaust, seem to be a lot of younger men, because ever since COVID happened and the government lied about a bunch of things, they say now we cannot trust literally anything the government says. And I'm like, yeah, you shouldn't trust, everything the government says, but saying I can't trust, literally everything they say is, I'm just throwing it in the wind, throwing it in the trash, whatever that may be. And so a lot of these young men will go to, Twitter or X or these different social media platforms looking for answers and discover all these things. So what would you say with that? Because we've also heard the term of you're looking for the truth that you want to know. So even if it's the actual truth, you're not going to accept it as the truth because it's not what you want to know.
Right. Like, so there's a lot of confirmation bias going on. And one thing I'm seeing, because on the right, we've sort of cultivated, especially since COVID, but it was going on before, it just wasn't as prominent. We've cultivated a disdain for institutional, generally just institutional knowledge or institutional hegemony, that because you gain social standing on the right by rejecting those institutional ideas, if the institutions ever believe something about history, you actually find people believe the alternative more, no matter what the actual evidence is, because it provides them some social credit on the right.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the term based has morphed into, is just, how radically can you undermine whatever you see as the quote unquote system right now. And the more based it is, the better it is. And I think that I would say that people who have the sense of, hey, I don't think I can trust institutions anymore at all, I think they're probably overreacting by just that in general. But if they want to hold that view, fine. Look at the actual evidence for these things, instead of just presuming that if it's information that goes against the institution as you see it, that it must be true. If you want to reject institutional knowledge, it's fine. Go to the original documents, go to the original sources, read the people from the period. You can do the legwork if you really want to, but I find a lot of people are lazy, and so they fall into the sort of gap of, well, the institutionals are telling me this, so therefore the opposite must be true. And that's in a weird way, it's actually allowing the institutions to control you, because whatever the leftist cultural hegemony says, you'll always do the opposite. So suddenly now you're just as controlled, because they know exactly how you're going to react and behave. It's always just going to be the opposite of whatever they say. Yeah. And I don't think that is at all a form of biblical discernment. And I think it is a pretty low view of truth to operate and live your life in that way. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people in the sphere who do have that mindset, if you look at the history of their worldview, even since 2020, just the last 4 or 5 years, a lot of these people have been through 5 or 6 different dramatic changes in their ideologies. A lot of people that were theonomists a year ago are now hardcore Christian nationalists. A lot of people that were hardcore libertarians 2 or 3 years ago are now, Deus Vult. We need I've converted to Catholicism, and now we need a Catholic integralist king or something. So I think that if you look at how they've reacted for the last 4 years, you can usually ascertain if they're really looking for the truth, or if they're just sort of addicted to the drug of reactionary politics. And there's more and more people that are falling into that camp, unfortunately. And I think one of the ways that Christians can be a good witness is to be consistent in our views, be willing to change our mind according to the evidences or the evidence presented, and holding up the torch of biblical righteousness for everybody to see, regardless of what the political implications are for them in that moment.
Yeah. And I mean, you even mentioned that some people are now coming out and saying, I'm, believe in Roman Catholicism now, and, I'm a Catholic and everything. And some of those people are, definitely sincere. And then, I know of Catholics that, even though, they have different, beliefs, that they're saved. But then also, being a Catholic in a way has kind of become a fad in a way. Like Candace Owens, all of her, anti-Semitic remarks, she says it's because of Christianity, and her husband's a very, very devout Roman Catholic. And then even Biden was like, oh, I'm a Catholic. And it's like, okay, now you're taking something and you're just saying, I'm that because that's, the thing that's trending now. And so, we mentioned about, people have in a way lost their minds a bit, since COVID. And we obviously, want to, you know, take what we've heard and what we're being told and, you know, take it through the lens of scripture. But then there's some people that are Christians and like fully agree with that, but then are like, but I still can't trust, everything the government says. So where do you think we should, in a way, draw a line? Because now, that Trump's in office, like, I'm more willing to listen to things like that the government's saying, like, the plane crashes, and he's like, DEI was a big part of it. And I'm like, yeah, I believe that, because he's not just saying DEI was a big part of that. He's literally showing the evidence of that. And, I posted on my LinkedIn yesterday, a screenshot of like the White House press. And it was like, it's crazy. Forget exactly how I put it, but I was like, it's crazy how, now I can listen to the White House press secretary speak without cringing.
Oh yeah, right.
And so it's like, obviously we want to take things through the lens of scripture, but then there's those people that say, yeah, we want to take things through the lens of scripture, but I still can't trust the government and can't listen to them. Where do you think for those people, where should we draw the line of what we listen to and what we take from them?
That's a good question. I mean, I do feel like one of the things that Trump has done on the right is build a really large amount of institutional power while convincing the right that institutional power is in some way intrinsically evil and or at least intrinsically dishonest. And I don't know how the right is going to handle that now that we do have so much institutional power. I think the argument that the left still has a total cultural control is wearing very thin in the minds of a lot of people. And some people may disagree with that, disagree with me on that. But I think that even in media, that has started to shift some, and that's been pretty clear that the culture has moved back towards the right, especially since like 2016. I remember 2016 was so incredibly insane in terms of what the left was saying and doing and what they were advocating for. And if you compare some of that rhetoric to the left more broadly today, I think that the right's pushback against the woke stuff has definitely had an impact, a positive impact of trying to restore some order in that regard. But I don't know. I don't know how the right's going to handle that. You have a lot of people on the right that are very happy that Trump's in power, that like you mentioned, still really hate any sort of institutional knowledge or influence at all. And so I think what will happen if the right isn't careful is a lot of those people, especially the ones that are not believers, are going to get picked up by the left. And I think the left will probably make a shift and try to pick up some of those people that feel disenfranchised now that they can't be the anti-institutional people while being pro-Trump and pro-right-wing. So I don't know. We'll just have to see. Current events and things happening like right now are a lot harder to figure out than things that happened 5 or 10 years ago, just because we can analyze them with the benefit of hindsight. And I don't think Christians have any sort of mandate to give our hot takes on everything every moment of the day. I think that's actually pretty toxic, and a lot of times ends up with people making really dumb statements that they later will regret. And I think you can look at certain figures who are now pretty prominent on the political right that said some things even around 2020 that they're embarrassed by today. And so I think a general slowing of our time to react would probably be good, and being less willing to make just the most bold and extreme statements at any given moment, I think will cost us a little bit politically in the short term, but long term will probably be beneficial in terms of the direction of the country and the culture and the church at large.
Yeah. And I mean, you even mentioned that there's, those people that said something in 2020 and now regret it. And in a way we're like, yes. But, I was listening to this, it might have been, I was listening to a Green Beret react to, the new Army commercial, super manly, uh, way far from what it used to be, and which is very good. Um, it might have been him where he was saying, everyone's like, well, you said this back then, you said this, 2, 3, 5 years ago. And he's like, yeah, but you think views don't shift? Like, you think I'm going to hold the exact same position that I held, 10 years ago that I held now? It's like, even some people, it's, okay, maybe you weren't born in a Christian household and now you're a Christian. Like, you think views don't change? Views do change. Some fundamental, morals may not change, but to say that, your views shouldn't change and your views don't change, that's just like, really? You think so? Okay, cool.
Yeah. Yeah. I know people during COVID that thought it was going to be the end of the world.
Yeah. Literally.
Yeah, exactly. Very quickly, about, less than a year after that, we're trying to convince everyone that that they never believed that. And you can find images of different prominent people on the dissident right who were wearing masks outside in 2020. And somebody will occasionally post that picture, and they'll have to, say, oh, I didn't know what was going on at the time, and I've changed my opinion on this. And there have even been different. I think it might have been Joel Webben who he paid for an ad spot on Ally Beth Stuckey's program. It was like he paid her to interview him for 10 minutes or something. It was very odd. Like a year or more ago, and people were posting about this because he implied that Ally Beth Stuckey shouldn't be having a voice in politics because she's a woman, and that's sort of the thing that that is concerning to me, that the turnaround time between someone making a decision to do or say something to them changing their opinion on that is getting shorter and shorter. And it really, at what point does that become hypocrisy? I don't know. But it seems like the line between being just hypocrisy and people just changing their minds is getting blurred as people rapidly switch between Christian traditions and political beliefs. And I think that that's sort of an extension of what's been going on for a long time in the information age, but it's getting worse and worse. And I think we're seeing it now in the church. I think the tendency is that things that happen in the broader culture more widely usually happen to the church a few decades later. And I think that we're now seeing that happen to the church, whereas it happened to the culture more broadly several decades ago. And that's why it's important, I think, to put a lot more stock in things that pastors who have been pastors for a long time and been consistent have said. Guys like Doug Wilson, I think, do a good job of that. And less stock in maybe some guys that are in their mid-20s who are pastors who recently became prominent because of some sort of Christian nationalist tweet they made, right? So I do think the only way to resolve that is just rank ordering who you value their opinion of, or whose opinion you value, rather, based on how long they've been a believer and how consistent they've been, and not just respecting zeal over everything else. Because zeal is easy to get. You could be zealous about all kinds of things. It'd be just totally wrong. And that's an issue that I see.
Yeah. And it's definitely like, you're able to, the things that will get clicks on X or Twitter. You're able to get fame really quickly. It's just think about it before you just post it in the heat of the moment. And I mean, you even mentioned, how Joel Webben paid Ally Beth Stuckey to interview him for 10 minutes or so, and then was like, Ally Beth Stuckey shouldn't be in the political realm, like, because she's a woman and everything. It's like, then why'd you pay her to interview you? It's like, because I know that will get me clicks and that will get me fame. And I mean, it's even things like, and this will kind of go into another subject and topic that I want to ask about. But at the beginning of beginning-ish of 2024, Eric Kahn had Will Spencer on his podcast and was talking about different things like manliness and everything. And Eric Kahn was, agreeing and full in favor of what, Will was saying. At the end of 2024, when, things started shifting drastically, he removed that episode, and Will was tweeting on X the exact same things he said in that episode. And Eric Kahn was attacking him and saying, no, that's not right. And it's like, I literally said the exact same things on the interview a couple months ago, but no one will know that because you removed it from the face of the earth.
Right.
And so, as we've seen in more recent months and weeks of more of like anti-Semitism in the church. So like for instance, I saw Angel Studios' rendition of Bonhoeffer, which wasn't exactly amazing. I thought it was well done from a filmmaking perspective. But it's some Mormons trying to create a movie about a guy that has poor theology.
Yeah,
not
that's
a great
probably
mix.
that's kind of my opinion on it too. I have not seen it, so let me be clear, but that's why I'm pretty wary of it. Is exactly for that reason as you described.
And so I enjoyed it from like a filmmaking aspect and how it was shot and everything. But I went to see it, with my dad, who's a pastor, and he was pointing out these different things and everything. And at the end of it, at the end credits, it was like, in 2023, 2023 was one of the worst years of anti-Semitism, and protests and riots and everything like that, in the United States. And it was like, let this never happen again. And that was more the message of, Bonhoeffer was like, there's so much anti-Semitism going on. Like, we're going to make this movie to show you that it actually happened. And like, this is bad stuff and don't deny it. And like 2023, we had a lot of bad anti-Semitism stuff. Don't ever let the Holocaust happen again. And so like, I looked over at my dad, and I was like, and then in 2024, that's when it infected the church. And I mean, it might have infected the church before then. But that's kind of when things in like the Reformed space started heating up a lot with, Joel Webben and Eric Kahn and Brian Sabe coming out, with all these anti-Semitic remarks. And even like, I never listened really to Joel Webben before. But then, I was like, I'm hearing all these things, but I want actually like some evidence. So I listened to a short bit of a live stream from Right Response Ministries. And he was like, we were planning on doing a movie review of Bonhoeffer. And Angel Studios put out this thing that was like, if you're an anti-Semite, then we'll let you have a free ticket because you need to see this movie. And he was like, we went to the box office and was like, I want my free ticket to go see Bonhoeffer. And they were like, what's going on? Like the box office person was so confused. And he's like, it's like Angel Studios said, any anti-Semites get free tickets. He was like, I am an anti-Semite. I want a free ticket. And they were like, I can't just hand out free tickets. And they were like, where's your proof? And he's like, did you ever hear about the Antioch Declaration? He's like, I never signed it and I'm never going to. And I'm like, oh my word, just chill. Like you have enough money to go buy a ticket. But so, as we're seeing in the Reformed space, anti-Semitism and Holocaust denialism heat up a lot. Where do you think that maybe anti-Semitism and this Holocaust denialism started infecting the church, and why?
So I don't know. I don't really like the term anti-Semitism generally because I find that it encompasses a lot of things, and in the same way that I generally avoid the term racism when having these sort of discussions because I think it's ill-defined. I don't like using the term anti-Semitism. I think that there are a lot of people that have a disdain for Jews, a sinful hatred of people who are Jewish ethnically, for a lot of different reasons. I don't think it's necessarily anything new in the church for there to be tension between Jews and Christians religiously. I think that that's gone back a long time, even to guys like Luther and everybody, you know, in the Middle Ages and everything. You can't deny that there has been some serious tension there, and it's often resulted in violence. The thing that I'm seeing now more that I think is ultra pernicious is, I guess there's two things. One of them would be a disdain for Judaism as a religion that's not on the basis of knowledge of the religion. I think it was Calvin Robinson, who was also on Right Response one time, and said that, you know, he's like, oh yeah, I didn't know that the Jews felt the way they do about Jesus until I asked Grok on Twitter, and he gave me some passages from the Talmud. And I was like, okay, you may want to know a little bit more about this than just what the AI tells you if you're a public figure talking about these topics.
Literally.
So that concerns me a little bit, but I do think there obviously is a very strong biblical case for the evils of Talmudic Judaism. That's just obvious. I mean, they deny Christ. They've built sort of an extension of the Pharisaical worldview into their modern religion. I mean, that's clear. I don't think there's any dispute around that. Even among people that are dispensationalists, people are aware of this. I think that the idea that your average American evangelical doesn't understand that Jews do not worship Christ is silly. I think they do know and understand that on average. So that's kind of like the one camp would be a critique of the religious side of it without any sort of knowledge of it. And then the other end would be a more unique thing to the 20th century compared to this stuff like Luther, which would be a hatred of Jews on an ethnic level. And guys like Corey Mahler would fall into this, that would say that that we as Christians have some sort of moral imperative through Scripture to hate people who are Jewish. And from his point of view, I have pretty good reason to believe he's talking about Jews just as a collective ethnic genetic identity. And I think that's pretty clearly, I'd say, satanic. I think that there's no biblical evidence that we're supposed to have like ethnic malice like that against the population. Interestingly enough, one of the things that was a difficulty within the National Socialist Party were Christians that had an issue with how Jews were being treated on the basis of just their blood. Whereas a lot of Christians, or a lot of Jewish people at the time who were genetically Jewish, were professing Christians. And there's people in my church today who are genetically Jewish. They have a Jewish background, and they're believers. And I think that I worry about that line sort of being blurred in the minds of a lot of people who just say Jews generally, when making these critiques, that they are lumping in some sort of eternal curse, as they see it, on the heads of other believers who are not religiously Jewish. They're my brothers and sisters in Christ, and I think that it's wrong to castigate them as uniquely evil on the basis of their genes. And I don't see a lot of people in, I guess, Webbin's sphere, Eric Kahn's sphere, those type of guys being clear about that so much. I see a lot more general discussion about Jews and a lot more of a blurring of those categories. And I think that is causing people to have a general animus that would be better directed at like sort of an informed understanding of Judaism as a religion. And the thing is, the secular world, which uses the term anti-Semitism much more broadly, would say that I'm probably anti-Semitic because I believe that Talmudic Judaism is fundamentally evil because it's a rejection of Christ, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right, and so that's kind of why I avoid using that term. And for the same reason that I think that the general cultural understanding of what the term racism means encompasses a lot of things that I also don't believe necessarily are sinful either. And so I have empathy for people who are against the uses of those terms, but I'm also not willing to completely go so far as to say, somebody who's worried about ethnic malice and bitterness is is not in a state of sinfulness. Or excuse me, I'm not willing to go so far as to say that ethnic malice and hatred is not sinful, which a lot of people have gone so far as to say.
Yeah. And so, you even mentioned like people in churches, they were literally, born and raised Jewish, and now they're Christians. It's like you even look at people like Will Spencer, who have a huge, voice in the Reformed world. He was born and raised Jewish, and now he's a Christian man. And it's like, there's just so much, in a way, baggage to the term Jew. And it's like, God does save people, just like God will save people from, Roman Catholicism, from Muslims, and like, if you think that, God can't save a Jew or God can't save a Muslim, then you clearly haven't read your Bible, because he saved Rahab and he saved so many others who you thought literally would never be saved. And so, as, this, Holocaust denialism and Jewish hatred has come up and has made this huge, rise in the world, we'll say, for the sake of this, it's become this much bigger thing, in 2024, 2025, a lot of, I don't know if I'm comfortable name dropping them, but there's, some like influencers who, have like 100,000 followers on YouTube, 300,000 followers on Instagram. And they're like, well, since all of this, Jewish hatred is going on, I need to, stand up for the Jews in a way. But then they go so far. Like, there was this one person that all they do is cover guitar music, and they say that, this person and their family go to a Baptist church, but then he's a Torah observant Christian, whatever that's supposed to mean. But then like when all of this stuff came out, it's like, well, I have to now stand up so much for the Jews. So he did a Christian, O Come, O Come Emmanuel Christian hymn on guitar, and built this whole set with like Jewish symbols in it, and like took this like sponsorship from this company that sells shoes with like Jewish symbols on them and everything. And so like, what would you say? Because it's like, obviously, we don't have to say everything, because people have already said things. We don't want to be those people that jump on literally every single thing. But then some people have jumped on it, but then they go too far, where it's like, what's going on here now?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people that in the Christian world who they just don't understand the political landscape at all. And I think that is actually not necessarily a bad thing. I don't think God calls all people to try to have influence in all spheres of life. And I think that we're going to see increasingly, just like we saw people with Black Lives Matter and some of these other things, people who will confuse those sorts of movements with a biblical standard of righteousness and try to hop on them. And I do cringe at the Angel Studios, like, this movie is against anti-Semitism, largely because I think it's just totally ineffective.
Yeah.
The people, like, you're not changing the minds of somebody who's a hardcore leftist, atheistic person because you made a movie that was against anti-Semitism. But what you are doing is sort of making a caricature of yourself as being somewhat ignorant of what's going on to people on the more conservative right side of the Christian worldview. or of the Christian world rather. And so there's some of that going on. I think that on both ends of it, kind of like how Romans 10 says, having a zeal for the Lord, but not according to knowledge. I think there's a lot of that going on. And I think it just so happens that your normie crowd that's against anti-Semitism happens to have less knowledge than the dissident right people. And they sort of expose themselves in that way because they don't understand the right. And I think that's one of the reasons I made my account was I'm trying to help people understand the mindset of some of these people on the right and what they're thinking, and then provide them good refutations of the areas that need refutation, and then in areas that they are actually correct on to point out that I think they're actually right in that way. As something like Angel Studios just being like, we're against anti-Semitism, it's like, okay, that doesn't really help anybody, and I don't think is really beneficial to the conversation at large. I think guys like Doug Wilson have done a much better job of that, and I think that's because they do have knowledge of that sphere. So
yeah, definitely. So as we've talked about, different anti-Semitism and Holocaust denialism, and more fully fleshed it out. This is also a result of the government lying to us and about COVID and everything, that people are just so bitter. They seem just so bitter and angry that they just won't listen. So maybe phrasing this a little differently, but how do we go about, because as you've mentioned, we don't like just saying, oh, I'm against anti-Semitism, voila, like doesn't do much. But how do we maybe go about fixing, in a way, this hatred towards the Jews and this denial of the Holocaust, as so many people are just bitter and angry and just don't want to listen to you?
I think you just have to have more like detailed, long-form conversations with them. I've tried to do that. I recently went on a podcast with a guy named Saint Militant from A Time for War, is I think his channel, and he's a National Socialist, like he's a Nazi. I think we had a relatively productive conversation, and I pushed back on him in some areas, and he pushed back on me in some different areas, and I think you really have to dig into what that person believes about Jews and why they believe it. Just saying broadly we don't like anti-Semitism is pretty is cursory and doesn't actually really refute anything. I think you do need to have the conversation, and they don't. And a lot of these guys don't like having this type of conversation. But you need to get to the point in the conversation where you can say, "Do you believe that it's righteous for a state to kill people on the basis of their genetics?" That's really fundamentally when at least we're talking about the World War II stuff, at least Nazi Germany, that's really what it comes down to. And there are people that believe, and they're wrong in terms of morality, but they think that was fine. And trying to draw that out in conversations is important. But a lot of them are against having conversations at that level of granularity or detail because it's very difficult to defend their positions when asked so poignantly about it, so just directly about it. And Christians need to be prepared to have those conversations at that level, and not feel like they are somehow being uncharitable by asking those sorts of direct questions. Another thing would be, in those conversations, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, if you're talking about the Holocaust, try to have them explain to you their alternative theory of what happened. And then once they do so, if you are equipped with knowledge about the subject, then you can bring up certain things that counter different areas of how they may view it. What shuts that down is if from the get-go you say, you're being anti-Semitic. Because there is such a spectrum of people in terms of why they believe these things, that a lot of them will, depending on their level of knowledge, will concede certain things they didn't originally intend to, just because you're bringing information to bear that they've never seen before.
Yeah.
There's a lot more people who have seen they must not have gassed people at Auschwitz because there were wooden doors in the gas chamber memes than there have been people that are aware of some of the things in the Goebbels diary that I post about.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we need to do is we need to equilibrate that disparity. We need to bring those other sort of details about that subject to bear in the conversation. And the only way we can do that is to know about those things. And so that's why I've been spreading it like crazy, because I think the conversations ultimately will get a lot better and we'll end up in a lot better place, so long as we're just actually caring about the truth of the subject, and willing to have long conversations with people that we do, have some serious moral disagreements with.
Yeah. And then, so, some people where there's kind of a line you want to draw with social media, because you don't want to be the person that jumps on every little thing, but then you don't want it to grow so large where, it's just like almost undefeatable. And so like I was, talking with, Jackson Krebsschatz, and, he was saying that he was told by this guy that, less social media is better, which, I'm like, oh, like fully agree with that. But then there's like, where do you draw the line? Because we need people on social media who are willing to say the things that need to be said. So, I mean, maybe this is a bad way to phrase the question, but where would you say we need to draw the line? Because we need people like you who are willing to say the truth. But then there's some people where it's literally like, dude, no one cares. Like it just doesn't matter that you're on here. You're doing absolutely nothing. And like you mentioned earlier, it might have been before we started recording, but you were like, there's not much, like, who knows how much of a difference, posting this on Twitter, posting this on Substack, posting this on YouTube will actually make.
I think God's going to give different people a heart for different groups of the population. And not everybody needs to be an apologist that goes after having conversations with Nazis. Yeah. And there's a lot of people that would probably do good to just butt out of it entirely. But I do think that as it becomes more mainstream, and just my interactions with pastors who send me DMs and stuff, I think a general knowledge of these topics is going to become more necessary, just so that the pastor who doesn't really have a lot of draw to minister to guys in these dissident spaces is still able to handle it when a young guy in his congregation, as I mentioned before, shows up to Bible study and starts talking about how Hitler was, the last, Christian prince of Western, Christian civilization. So I don't think there's just one right answer on how much Christians need to be involved with that. In terms of social media, the culturally impactful dialogues that are going on are happening on social media. They just are.
Yeah.
And so I don't think it is necessarily good for Christians to not participate in those, because I think Christians need to be in those spaces in order to exemplify Christ to the world. I think that's an evangelical component to it. But I don't think that Christian fellowship should primarily be based online. I think that people need to be in churches. Their primary Christian community needs to be in their church. Whatever Christian fellowship they can have online is great, but it is supplementary to their church community. And one thing that I am a little bit worried about and have seen some of is folks that are very they're full of zeal online about topics of Christianity, but when you investigate a little bit deeper, you find out that they're not actually in a local church, or they don't have accountability, and that is a concern to me. And I don't think the solution to that is pastors from churches somehow conforming to the social media age. I don't want my pastor to get up there and every week it be a tirade about his Twitter conversations. I think that would be horrible. I can't imagine a worse future than that, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
But at the same time, voices that are knowledgeable about topics that are relevant, I do think need to be online. I think guys like Mike Winger do a good job with that. I don't agree with Mike Winger about all kinds of theological topics, but I see him as somebody that is discerning and has done a really good job of putting biblical principles and thinking into the culture at large. And so it really just depends on how you do it, and if you are also accountable to an actual church body at the same time. And there needs to be an expectation on the right that that you are primarily a member of your church and not a member of your X or Twitter microculture.
Yeah. So I mean, because Doug Wilson put out an article a bit ago of like, to all of the anon accounts, like, on the last day of judgment, will you answer anon? And so, like, obviously you're anon, and for good reasons. But what are your thoughts maybe on other anon's accounts? Because, everyone says, HHC is the anon account that all the other anons blocked. So what would you say about, the other anon accounts? Because it's really, from what I've been told, it's very hit or miss. Some of it's like, college people that don't want to get kicked out of, college for what they say online, or some of it's like don't want to lose their job. But then some of it's, like undercover feds and different things like that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think if the reason if the authentic reason that you're anonymous online is because you have other people in your life that rely on your income or would be seriously damaged by being harassed over your activity online, and your activity online is righteous, I think it's reasonable to be anonymous online. I would say that everyone anonymous online should have a pastor and their church community be aware that they are anonymous online and what their anonymous account is. Because otherwise you don't have any sort of accountability generally for what you say on the internet. And I don't think that's biblical. But I do think there are some circumstances, like you mentioned, where it is reasonable to be anonymous. I do see, though, a lot of folks who are anonymous for the purpose of saying things that I think they deep down know are unrighteous and sinful, and not wanting to handle any real life repercussions for that at all. And I think that's wrong. Gladly, the culture seems to be shifting a little bit on that, and I see less and less of people who are fired from their job for holding various online opinions and things like this. So hopefully as that improves, it will be clearer in the argument why having anonymous accounts is something that comes with dangers, and that people should be held accountable, at least to their church body, for what they say on there. And I think to pretend like whatever you say on the internet is completely divorced from, biblical moral accountability is silly. And that's kind of slowly dying as real life and online start to merge more and more. I think long term it'll probably actually get better because of what I mentioned before. But
so as we wrap up this interview, any final thoughts, final words to the audience about, anything we've discussed in this, or, all of it that we've discussed in this interview? And then where can people find out more about your work, and what would maybe be some good recommendations for whether it's a book or a video or, a podcast to learn more about, the Jewish hatred and the Holocaust denialism that's brewing in this world?
Yeah, so I guess we're starting with recommendations. Doug Wilson's Blood and Honey book is really good. Or American Milk and Honey, that's what it is, not Blood and Honey. Blood and Honey's a beer. So I think it's American Milk and Honey. That's a great book. That's a good place to start on some of this. My content is on Substack. You can find me on Substack. Hitler Hated, I think it's Hitler Hated Substack is what I called it, just as a joke. And then Not Our Guy on YouTube, as well as, at Not Our Guy on X. So I have a lot of content on there. The when it comes to general advice, I pretty much said this earlier, but just being willing to have in-depth conversations with people that you have an initial repulsion to on the basis of whatever their politics are, I think is important. And not so much being open to anything at all. Like, we shouldn't be open to things that are explicitly unrighteous as Christians. But trying to understand why this person has come to that conclusion is important, and I think it will help us avoid looking ignorant and also being ineffective in our outreach to people in the political sphere if we can empathize with where they've ended up in their conclusions. And I see it that's lacking. And I hope the stuff that I've done online has improved that in my little way. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, awesome. All of those links will be in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting. Very much enjoyed it, and I hope it's edifying to the audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Elijah. And if you want to talk about anything again, just let me know, and we can chat.
Perfect.